Once again, thank you so much for joining us today, and my special gratitude goes to Chenxing for joining us in this hopefully very intimate and joyful conversation. I'm feeling quite excited about it, and it at the same time feels like many different things. It is sort of a library meeting with a beloved author. It is a conversation with an esteemed researcher and an accomplished practitioner who served as a chaplain and is sharing her experiences of doing many different types of work related to contemplative life in her two brilliant books. And so to avoid sounding too much like a fanboy, I'm just going to start with a formal introduction and read out Chenxing's most recent bio used in the press kit for her most recent book, One Long Listening. And so Chenxing is the author of another widely reviewed book, Be the Refuge, Raising the Voices of Asian American Buddhists, published by North Atlantic Books in 2021. She is a regular contributor to Lion's Roar, Tricycle, Buddha Dharma, and other publications, and a frequent speaker and workshop leader at schools, universities, and Buddhist communities. She holds a BA from Stanford University and an MA in Buddhist Studies from the Graduate Theological Union. Her chaplaincy training began in Cambodia and continued in the San Francisco Bay Area, where she completed a year-long residency on an oncology ward. She is also a co-organizer of May We Gather, a national Buddhist memorial for Asian American ancestors, and has served in a variety of capacities at the Institute of Buddhist Studies in Berkeley, California. Finally, her newest book, One Long Listening, is now available in paperback, as an audiobook, and as an ebook across multiple platforms. And we will be posting links for you to follow Chenxing's work in the chat here, and also in the video description on YouTube as well. Chenxing, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Lobsang, for that extremely generous introduction. And I'm really grateful for our mutual friend, Elaine Lai at Stanford, who I believe first introduced us a few years ago during the pandemic. And it's just so wonderful to reconnect. Thank you so much for the thoughtfulness and care that you've put into our dialogue today. And also thank you to everyone who's here. It's so wonderful to see some of your faces and see your names here on the screen. And thanks also to the people of the future who will be listening back on this as well.
So I believe you are now in the Bay Area, which is probably how you and I even came to know each other, because our shared friend, Elaine Lai, is spending a lot of time there doing her studies at Stanford University. We're actually hoping to have her as one of our future guest speakers for this series. But just to begin the conversation, because both of your books are on the importance of stories, telling stories, not forgetting other people's stories, not forgetting our own story, not losing our story amidst perhaps a wave of voices that are so different from our own. Would like to ask you a little bit about the history of your family, your own history, and how is it that you came to live in the Bay Area? Because I know there was a lot of slightly dramatic upheavals related to the pandemic and so forth, but even that journey in itself can be quite an interesting part of your biography and your creative work.
Sure. So I was born in Shanghai, China, and then I immigrated to the US at the age of 4. We lived first kind of on the East Coast in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and moved around to a lot of different apartments. I'm an only child. And my parents always lived in different places because they were working. And then eventually I lived in the Seattle, Washington area in the Northwest of the United States for junior high and high school. And then I took a gap year actually between high school and college. They're kind of uncommon in America. I think I actually first heard about them from people who spent more time in Europe and Australia. But I took a gap year and spent a good amount of that time in Asia, both teaching English in China, and then also had an opportunity to travel through Hong Kong and Nepal, Thailand, Tibet. So I was really struck by encountering Buddhism in all of these different areas. And I should add that I was raised in an atheist household, not uncommon as a child of Chinese immigrants who lived through the Cultural Revolution. So I had an interest in spirituality, I'd say as a young child, just interest in questions around life and death and meaning, but never really felt a very strong affinity for the dominant religion of this country, which is Christianity, though of course one is immersed in it, so one picks up bits and pieces. And encountering Buddhism, I felt just a real curiosity and an affinity, seeing it in Asia during this gap year, and then returning back to the US for college in the San Francisco Bay Area, certainly one of the most diverse Buddhist places in the world, perhaps. There are just so many different traditions and forms of Buddhism here. And so just started exploring that more in college, both through visiting local communities and also through reading more about Buddhism from many different strands. So that was really the beginning of my time in the Bay Area. But for anyone who's been here, you'll know that it's very big. I often spend a whole day driving 3 or 4 hours around the Bay Area, both because it's very large and because there's traffic. So I've lived in the southern part as well as the eastern part, which is east of San Francisco. I've lived in several places in the Bay Area since college. So now about half my life, I would say. But I've also spent some time abroad, whether that was studying abroad in South Africa as a junior in college for a summer, but also spending, again, more time in Asia with my partner. My husband is a scholar of Southeast Asian Buddhism and literature. And so we've lived in Cambodia and Thailand, which is in fact where we lived for much of the 4 years prior to the pandemic. We sort of bounced between Southeast Asia and here in the Bay Area. And that kind of vantage point certainly influences my work as well. We were living in Thailand in March 2020 when the pandemic really, took off here in the US. And we came back to the US for what we thought would be a month-long visit and ended up being stranded here. So we've been here ever since. Fortunately, our parents live here, our family and friends. So eventually our things that were in Bangkok, including the manuscript for my second book, One Long Listening, came back to us by sea shipment. I think it took about 4 months or so, 4 or 5 months. And then actually another big transition is coming up as we're preparing to move to Michigan, which is a few thousand miles, many thousands of kilometers away. So another step on the journey. But something that I think has been really extraordinary is that pretty much everywhere I go, whether that's traveling in Asia for work or just for learning or spending time in Europe or, in South Africa was one of the first times I actually encountered a lot of different Buddhist communities. I'm really struck by the diversity of the Buddhist world. And I often think of Buddhists, particularly, those of us in Western countries where, Buddhists are a minority. And I think of us all as part of this very vast family tree with common roots. Perhaps we could say roots in the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, the 3 gems. And the expression of Buddhism looks very different. Maybe there are many fruits on this tree, many different types of fruit, many different kinds of branches. And a lot of my work is just interested in learning more about these branches and getting people talking to each other, particularly in contexts where Buddhists are the minority. And I think it's really possible to build kind of intra-Buddhist spiritual bridges, not to mention, of course, inter-religious bridges with people of other faith backgrounds.
It seems that Be the Refuge is exactly the intersection of everything that you've mentioned, because it is a book that you were able to create on the basis of your conversations with multiple people, especially from the Bay Area, even though I know you've spent multiple hours also interviewing people from other parts of the US and then transcribing the interviews and so forth. But in addition to that, it is a book about learning about all the different fruits on the tree of Buddhism and seeing how many varieties there actually are, and therefore counteracting our stereotypes that to be a Buddhist means to be a meditator, and ideally also good white meditator and all those sorts of things. So for both out of my own curiosity and for those who are just getting introduced to your work for the first time, could you talk a little bit about how Be the Refuge came to be as a book, how you crafted the original research and how that turned into a book that has now been so well received and has had a powerful impact, has had a powerful effect on the body of American Buddhism as we know it?
Sure. I mean, I suppose part of that life story that I just shared is part of the book. And I'd say one major event was the death of my grandmother. At that point, she was quite elderly. She lived in Shanghai for most of her life, and was living with us in California. And at that time, I was working a particular job on the East Coast and actually decided to quit the job to move back to California to be able to spend time with her. And then I had some liminal time of trying to discern what was next. I did some volunteering with hospice and also chaplaincy or spiritual care. And that kind of rather circuitous journey led me to the Institute of Buddhist Studies in Berkeley, California, which is the oldest Buddhist seminary in the United States. It's part of a Jodo Shinshu tradition or Pure Land tradition in Mahayana Buddhism, actually the most popular form of Buddhism in Japan today, and also the oldest continuous running organization in North America, Buddhist organization in North America, is the Buddhist Churches of America, which is part of the Nishi Honganji sect of Jodo Shinshu. So it's quite humbling to end up here. I'd gotten there because I'd done a year-long training that was once a month on Buddhist chaplaincy, and it happened to count for course credit at this school. So I went there and I realized I knew nothing about this form of Buddhism in America that's been here since the 19th century, since the late 19th century. I knew about things like insight meditation or Zen or these kind of more popular forms of Buddhism in the media, which are, also well and good and wonderful. I myself have spent a lot of time in those communities, have many friends who practice in those traditions, but it was rather discomforting to realize that this whole entire, not just history, very important history, but also very much living tradition was kind of erased from my consciousness, that I had ignored it all this while. And so this is a predominantly Japanese American tradition in the US, but actually from its inception, it's always been a multiracial community, multi-ethnic, and increasingly becomes that. And so here I am learning a lot from these new spiritual friends, new Buddhist friends at the Institute of Buddhist Studies, which has always welcomed people from different Buddhist backgrounds. It has a Buddhist chaplaincy program, it's part of a consortium of theological schools. So many Christian and Hindu and Muslim and Jewish and other spiritual friends come and take the classes. So it's a very rich environment for this kind of exchange. And I needed to write a thesis. And I wasn't sure what to do at first. And fortunately, at the time, my husband and, then partner had noticed that there was this blog called The Angry Asian Buddhist. And I thought, oh, that's a very interesting blog name that certainly makes a person sit up and take notice. We don't expect in this country Asians to be angry. There's kind of a stereotype that we don't rock the boat and we're kind of quiet. And then we certainly don't expect Buddhists to be angry. There's kind of a stereotype that we're always calm and we don't even have emotions. There's all of these things going on. And so that name, of course, was a kind of skillful means. And in particular, the author of this blog was a young adult Asian American Buddhist who was interested in these issues of race and representation. He wrote very explicitly that he knew Buddhism is far from a Buddhist value. In fact, so many Buddhist texts caution us against the dangers of anger. And at the same time, he wondered, sometimes anger in ourselves can be a source of information. It can be a source of energy, as one of my chaplaincy supervisors once said. For example, when we feel anger at a kind of injustice. And for the Angry Asian Buddhist, he was really writing, I would say, out of a deep love for his communities, particularly those of Asian American Buddhists. And what I learned through reading his blog and also through reading a Pew Forum report, a statistical report in 2012, was that though only about 1% of Americans may identify as Buddhists, over 2/3 of them are of Asian heritage. And this really surprised me because the media representation, in fact, seemed to be quite the opposite. It was predominantly focused on white convert Buddhists and meditation. And so I was just kind of curious, well, what are we missing by not listening to the voices that we don't understand? And for myself, as an Asian American and also convert Buddhist, I felt I couldn't quite understand where I fit. There was this sort of trope that kept coming up over and over again in both the popular and the academic literature around this idea that there are two Buddhisms, two categories of Buddhisms, two camps of Buddhisms, two mutually exclusive streams, if you will, of white converts on the one side and Asian American immigrants or heritage Buddhists on the other. And certainly those are categories, I think, that have some merit. But I think that particular binary, as we often think in Buddhism, binaries can be a little tricky if we feel somehow that we can only choose one or the other. I started wondering, well, what about our Black Buddhist friends and those who are, Latinx or Native American or mixed race? Where do they fit? And where do I fit, for that matter, as someone who was not raised Buddhist, but converted into it? And also I noticed how these categories were a little bit flattening. They seemed to assume that even all white converts were one and the same, as if there weren't generational differences, as if there weren't differences in socioeconomic class or ways of practice. And so I decided to focus on one half of the binary, Asian American Buddhists, as a pan-ethnic and pan-sectarian group of people. And I decided to talk to young people in their 20s and 30s, partly because it was easier from a language perspective than to interview people from a wide range of ethnic backgrounds while using the language of English, our common shared language of English. And that's really how the project began. As this master's thesis, when the Angry Asian Buddhist had written this blog post saying, instead of thinking of us as stereotypes, why not just go out and talk to Asian American Buddhists, get to know them? And I realized, well, I myself have never really done the same, even though I might fit into this category. And so I began to just start talking to people and listening to them.
So how were you able to find the group of people that you interviewed for the project, and sort of what was the demographic? What were the research parameters for that?
I was pretty flexible because I thought I wouldn't get anyone to speak to me. I said young adult, 20s, 30s, a few young at heart 40-year-olds slipped in. I said, if you're Asian American, and by that, I don't mean just East Asian, like Chinese or Japanese or Korean. I mean, you can trace some or all of your heritage to any part of Asia. So there were people from West Asia, Central Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and East Asia who spoke to me, or people whose parents had come from there. And, I said, you don't need American citizenship either if you're living here in the US. And that, I think, is enough for the purposes of my study. And I said, in terms of Buddhist, you don't have to be a card-carrying or robe-wearing Buddhist. You don't even have to be, quote unquote, out as a Buddhist. Just if you're interested in Buddhism, you feel some kind of affinity for it, I'd love to talk to you. And I did this because really I wasn't so interested in putting people into boxes or defining very strictly what it meant to be Asian American Buddhist. I was actually quite interested in what were the possibilities of this category, perhaps also its limits. But we got to have some really in-depth conversations. The Angry Asian Buddhist, who's we might get back to in a little bit, but he actually helped me by putting out a call for interviewees. I'd been part of different Buddhist communities, so I put out a call that way. I asked every person to recommend more person. And before I knew it, I'd interviewed 26 people in person. And these interviews were between an hour and a half to 5.5 hours long because people had just so much to say. It felt like, oh, I'd really hit a nerve. And then there were so many more people who wanted to be interviewed. So I ended up adapting those interviews to an email format and interviewed an additional 63 people, many of whom I've actually subsequently, become friends with or had long interview exchanges with. So often it wasn't just a one-off email, but an ongoing exchange and dialogue. And so by the time I'd finished, I had 89 interviews, and I realized that this had far exceeded the parameters of a master's thesis. No one really reads master's theses anyway. And I felt a kind of responsibility to these stories to share them with a broader group of people.
And for those, for our listeners, I would just say that if you read the book, these stories are really incredibly vulnerable, incredibly human, incredibly touching in how people just talk about the rawness of their feelings, about the complexities of race, identity. And it's not always about just that. It's sometimes about trying to sheepishly find our way into our heritage, or grappling with our heritage, trying to understand and trying to understand which parts of it are applicable in our daily life. And there's so many different concerns that people are raising and sharing. And it's truly beautiful to just see those stories shared, which then, because Chenxing's book became quite influential, just helps to amplify that entire field of work where more and more emerging voices can be heard, not emerging, not in terms of that they didn't exist, but just in terms of finally being given a platform that is at least as accessible as the platform that has been historically given to white voices in American Buddhism and in some other countries as well. I mean, I'm in the UK right now, so the situation is both similar and slightly different, and we can all look at the different countries and communities of which we are a part and see if what's described in Be the Refuge applies. I think it's very educational from that point of view as well. But on the point of being educational, could you talk just a little bit about how that stereotype or idea of two Buddhisms emerged in the United States? Because in one of your interviews, you talked about its connection to the beatnik movement in the 60s and so forth. So just for us to understand that overall historical dynamic.
Sure. Yeah. My advisor at the Institute of Buddhist Studies, Scott Mitchell, has a really wonderful book coming out with Oxford University Press called The Making of American Buddhism. So I highly recommend it. That really gives a wonderful history. In a very brief nutshell, this idea of two Buddhisms really started gaining maybe scholarly cachet in the 60s and 70s with the scholar Charles Prebish, who at the time was studying American Buddhism. That itself already was, not an easy choice when Buddhist studies was more focused on philology and studies in Pali and Sanskrit and Buddhist texts rather than contemporary Buddhism. And of course, at the time, Buddhist studies was also very much focused in Asia and less, in diaspora or in America or in the West in general. And so when Charles Prebish coined this term two Buddhisms, he actually didn't mean for it to have kind of racialized connotations per se. He was just noticing actually different forms of organization, some that had been around for a long time, like the Jodo Shinshu Buddhists, and then these new groups that were coming up, whether kind of these hippies and beatnik generation, the 60s and 70s, Zen. And what many people don't know is how much the beat poets were themselves influenced by the Buddhist churches of America, by Jodo Shin Buddhists. So Scott's book, The Making of American Buddhism, really brings to light some of these really interesting connections. People like Gary Snyder being published very early on in actually publications run by Jodo Shinshu Buddhists. And so there's actually much more to learn to complicate this story. But for a long time, I think this notion, especially as it's been deployed into the popular media realm, has started kind of separating and almost segregating these two forms of Buddhism, even, to the extent where I would go to a Buddhist community and especially at a predominantly white convert community, and people would just assume I was raised Buddhist, which I wasn't. I was like, oh, that's curious. Or they would also assume once I said, oh, well, I'm Chinese American, they said, oh, well, you must practice Chinese Buddhism. I was like, well, it's actually a little more complicated than that. And so I often like to say that demographics are not determinative. Just because someone is Laotian does not mean they're going to practice Laotian Buddhism, like Brian, one of my interviewees who grew up in that tradition, but ended up founding a Buddhist club at his high school that welcomed people from all backgrounds, including people who were just starting to study meditation. And then when I interviewed him, he was actually very deeply in a Korean Buddhist tradition that he'd come across in Southern California. So yeah, I think what really struck me the most was juxtaposing this sort of complexity and diversity of these stories against these simplified or sometimes reductionist categories. And I think all heuristics, all categories, we make them for a reason. We need them to an extent, but it's always helpful to really question what are the impacts of our categories. And what disturbed me about reading more about two Buddhisms was it seemed more and more like there was this valorization of quote unquote rational, enlightened, white convert meditators. And by contrast, these kind of superstitious or even backwards Asian immigrants. And this was quite disturbing to start reading this in both sometimes veiled and sometimes actually not so veiled forms in, again, popular media. And for someone like Aaron, who wrote The Angry Asian Buddhist, he wondered, what impact does this have on young people who grew up in the US and the only forms of Buddhism they're seeing are people who don't look like them and people who are even saying, wow, the Buddhism your aunt, your grandmother, your uncle practices, that's backwards. That doesn't have anything to contribute to this society. That's a deeply disempowering message. And in fact, rates of conversion out of Buddhism among Asian Americans are higher than rates of conversion into it. And I think all of this has a broader impact. So, representation is not the end all be all, but it does matter. And I often think it especially matters at the level of education. And I think especially at the level of young people during very important times of identity formation and finding a sense of belonging and really looking to root themselves spiritually, find a path, find a way, find friends along the path. It's not very inviting when the narrative is such that it's actually denigrating one's own culture and family and heritage.
Right. So I'd like to address the elephant in the room by saying that when white people, myself included, hear all of this or read books like Be the Refuge and so forth, there is immediately for some people a triggering of white guilt. And then people start feeling, oh, does that mean I'm part of the problem? Does that mean I'm bad? So, and then there's either reaction of refusing to listen, or there is an open-ended question about like, what can be done? How can I be part of the solution and not the problem? And I think part of that is trying to make the convert spaces more welcoming, more accepting, more equal in terms of, or equitable in terms of what they can offer to multiple communities, not just Asian American Buddhists or white quote unquote Buddhists, but also to people from completely different backgrounds. But another thing that happens is, of course, that white converts go to heritage Buddhist places of worship, communities, and so forth. And that's how some of the earliest organizations, including the San Francisco Dharma Center, originally emerged by white people, white students joining Suzuki Roshi and his first Japanese temple in San Francisco. But this is where there's then the issue of cultural sensitivities. I would just like to ask, what are the ways in your understanding of honoring those communities with proper sensitivity, proper humility, proper respect, so that everyone can actually benefit from that exchange?
Yeah, this is such a great question. I'm really glad you brought up this topic, Lobsang. Maybe by way of answering it, I want to highlight two things. So first, I want to circle back to the angry Asian Buddhist whose name was Aaron J. Lee. For those who've read Be the Refuge, you'll know that he is woven throughout. He quickly became a dear friend. I remember when Scott, my advisor, had me get in touch with him, and I was quite afraid. I thought maybe this guy's really angry or not very nice, and he ended up being just the friendliest and most generous person. And it's probably worth mentioning that Aaron was half Toisanese American, multiple generation on his father's side, and Ashkenazi Jewish on his mother's side. So he was half white, he was mixed race. And I think that's something that he always held with a lot of sensitivity. And so to this question of white guilt, I think it's just always, it's an understandable reaction. And I think Aaron's response to that was a reminder that our heritages are complex, our families, our friends, our coworkers are of these different racial backgrounds. And so part of wanting to do this work is really for spiritual friendship, right? As Ananda said, not the half of the holy path, but really the whole of the holy path. And I think one really beautiful way that I've seen spiritual friendship manifest is through a project I've been involved in called Listening to the Buddhists in Our Backyard. This project came about quite unexpectedly on Twitter, of all places, when a high school teacher in Massachusetts reached out to me and said he'd read Be the Refuge, and he was wondering, after teaching for 12 years at Phillips Academy, Andover, a boarding school in Massachusetts, as a religion philosophy teacher, he taught a lot of Buddhism. His name's Andy Huzio, and Andy just said, I really wonder what it would look like to teach Buddhism differently, to not begin with the Four Noble Truths or the Eightfold Path, but to actually begin with the Buddhists right here locally. And in Andover, Massachusetts, we did a Google search. There were easily a dozen Buddhist temples: Thai, Vietnamese, Cambodian, Lao, Chinese. And we were blown away. We thought, okay, let's design a course where a small group of students can really immerse themselves. Andy and some of his coworkers had done extraordinary work laying the groundwork for a special program where high school seniors, for their final spring term of high school, could drop all of their usual 5 or 6 classes. And for 10 weeks, they just immersed themselves in this study. They didn't have Buddhist background for the most part. They really didn't know anything, but they just showed up. We took them to these local temples. We spent, I think, our first 8 days just deeply immersed. After just a few days of orientation, deeply immersed in these communities. I learned an extraordinary amount. I realized, even for myself living in California, I don't always take the time to visit the Buddhists in my own backyard. It really kind of reoriented how we thought about teaching Buddhism and also being Buddhist. Sandy and myself are both Buddhists, convert Buddhists. And I think, thank you, Lobsang, for putting the link into the chat. The students created a wonderful website and wonderful work, but I see them as a model of like, what's the first step? Sometimes that looks like just putting ourselves into a place where maybe the people around us don't look like us, don't even speak a language that we know, and aren't familiar. It's disorienting, it's uncomfortable, it's scary. We had to go through all of these emotions, all of the fears of doing something wrong, and still to show up and notice, for ourselves, we were met with such extraordinary generosity, and it really both shaped and challenged our understanding of, oh, what does it mean to be just a good spiritual friend to other people, whatever you identify as spiritually. What does it look like to make oneself vulnerable as a guest? And then that, I think, really informs how we ourselves can be better hosts for others. And so I would love to see more of this kind of crossing over and interaction. Yes, of course, books are well and good, but yeah, what does it look like to ask a coworker who might have a Buddha amulet or a malabi? What does it look like to share? I have a Buddhist practice and it's like this. What is your Buddhist practice like? Would you like to visit each other's places of worship? Would you like to share a cup of tea together? I often think, these things, they can feel like, oh, this is just a to-do list. A checklist I have to do to build friendships, or this is some kind of chore. Or on the flip side, we get so tense and so worried about doing something wrong that we forget, like, the good friends in our lives, sometimes we meet them by happenstance, by circumstance, by causes and conditions, by seeming coincidence. And sometimes those first meetings are awkward, right? And over time, we can laugh back at each other. And so perhaps speaking to the specific question, I often invite people, to inhabit a kind of intimacy of the beginner's mind, and also just a sense of humor. Like, if you mess up, it's okay. Ask for forgiveness, apologize. And I think if we're able to be gentler with ourselves and that kind of judgment, and gentler with other people, we can remember building friendship can be, these bridges of spiritual friendship can be so joyful. And truly, that listening to the Buddhists in our backyard that semester was, we all said, we're going to remember this for the rest of our lives. And we have lifelong spiritual friends that we made that would never have happened if we hadn't gone out there and took the risk and said, oh, we had this weird class. Is it okay if we come by? And there, of course, we just try to be, as humble and curious and open-minded and gracious as we can be, and be as generous as we can be. We all know how to do this, right? To listen attentively, to show our care and thoughtfulness, to ask simple and respectful questions for it. With that, I think when our intentions, are good, again and again, like we were reminded at these temples, we plant these good seeds and hope that they will then bear good fruit.
This very much corresponds to my own experience, to be honest, because in this day and age, I'm seeing a lot of American convert Buddhist spaces trying to become more welcoming and more equitable when it comes to inviting more people of color, and more specifically the new converts among Black Buddhists of America, Native American Buddhists, Buddhists of Latinx heritage, and so forth. And at the same time, there's a reluctance to learn from the original holders of this tradition, the Asian American Buddhists, or just in general Asian Buddhists. But I have never been as welcomed as I have been with the Tibetan community that has really taken such incredibly good care of me over multiple decades. And not only in terms of the incredible generosity in sharing the Dharma and the teachings and the transmissions, and when I was back among the monastic ordination, all of that, but just in simple terms of offering food and sharing meals and teaching me the language skills and just all of that. And that, I think that is certainly an invitation that I can definitely suggest myself. Please, if you have local Buddhist communities that you might want to get in touch with, specifically heritage communities, it might be, we all might feel sheepish about that, but I think that is so incredibly important, both in terms of just opening up our mind to other cultures in general, but especially if we identify ourselves with the Buddhist tradition, there needs to be, in my humble opinion, a sense of awe towards the original holders of this lineage, which has nothing to do with simply worshiping the old traditions and so forth. It's just about understanding that something worked over multiple centuries, and we might be wise to look at that. And on this question of something working, I'd like to ask you a question that you originally asked to the participants of the research. And for our listeners, Appendix 2 in Be the Refuge is the list of all the questions that Chenxing asked to the interviewees. So the question is really simple. Which Buddhist teachings or beliefs are most important to you? And I would add at the moment, because we all know that a specific theme might come to the forefront of our mind in a specific period of our life, and then it switches to something else. But right now, which Buddhist beliefs and teachings do you find most applicable, most inspiring, sort of a guiding light in your own journey at this point?
Oh, you're right. That is such an impasse now. I feel like it was unfair that I asked this question because it's such a difficult question to answer. My goodness. Gosh, I guess what you just said about, generosity, dana, that feels ever present, ever foundational, ever important, ever like a practice. I notice when moments of greed or impatience come up in myself, sort of things that are the opposite of being generous, that dana. And so that's an ongoing practice. And I think that takes many forms. And then also sila, ethics, that also feels very foundational. I think in the context of this conversation, these two come up because they are just ever pervasive throughout my life. And again, it feels a bit like, the air I breathe, or the metaphor I give in the book is that becoming Buddhist felt like water becoming tea. If you put tea in water, it starts to take on the flavor and the color and the qualities of that tea. It's hard to say at what point water becomes tea, but soon, it's completely suffused. And so in a way, I feel my life is totally suffused with these Buddhist teachings, but I think I see generosity and ethics really running through many different Buddhist traditions. Certainly their precise expressions may look different, especially with ethical precepts, but it's just something that I actually find quite joyful. So maybe that's what ties it together. Like, I don't really see precepts as a kind of like punishing or like restrictive kind of thing. I think they are the kind of limits that actually allow us to access boundless possibility, the way that sometimes, having a deadline can help you access some creative potential. If I never had a deadline for this book, it would never exist, right? And similarly with ethical precepts, I think some of the people I just most admire, my spiritual teachers, mentors, friends, have a beautiful way of living out what the precepts mean in their life. And I think often in the US here, there can be so much emphasis on meditation or jhana or concentration that we lose sight of these other really foundational practices. And many, I think, really influential to me, spiritual teachers have reminded me again and again. And I would say, spiritual teachers are people I meet every day, and also non-people, like the trees and the earth and the plants and just all the life that's around us, the rock that is so, so old and to which we will return. But there are just all of these teachers that teach me what it means to live a wise and ethical life.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I especially love the metaphor of the tea, because indeed, even one quality that we bring into our practice can completely transform the overall flavor of our existence, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who comes in contact with us. And I think one other question from that big questionnaire that was really interesting to me, and that I would also like to ask you, was what would you like to ask other Asian American Buddhists? So if you had unlimited time and unlimited access to other Asian American Buddhists to continue the said research and to present more stories, and even though I guess at some point it might get a bit tedious if you had to do all that work instead of everyone else, because that's something we can all share in. But what other questions would you pose to them?
Right now it's really the question, what brings you joy? And in that, I'm inspired by thinking just about many Black thinkers and artists and creative writers in the media. We can read endless stories of suffering, whether that is, violence and brutality against Black people at the hands of police, historically and in the present day, whether that's anti-Asian violence in the news, which is very heavy to read about, whether that's gun violence. And right now I have a dear friend visiting with her 3-year-old daughter from Japan. They're actually at the service at the Jodo Shinshu Center right now in Berkeley. And the other day we were just at a playground, and it just happens to be in a neighborhood that's like very much multiracial, and just to see all of these kids from different backgrounds just having so much fun and so much joy, just really, I don't know, it gave me so much hope, I think, and also just a sense of like mudita, just sharing in their joy. And I think sometimes I notice this myself too. I get so caught up in like the suffering or all the things that have gone wrong. And even for myself, like kind of a critical person. So what are all the things that are wrong? And I think that's the question I'd love to ask the most. What's bringing you joy, and what's, really creatively lighting up your life right now? I think that's a question I'd almost love to ask anyone, regardless of their background. But yeah, I love that question. Thank you so much for asking it.
Well, it is a beautiful question. And I think definitely whatever the answers are, they usually delight everyone's heart. And that's such a wonderful thing to explore. And in addition to that, probably something that was already palpable in the book itself, would be the refuge, in terms of, yes, there are people sharing their difficulties and challenges and anger and frustration and a sense of profound loneliness in many cases, which is both heartbreaking and inspires one to action. But at the same time, just the strands of intergenerational joy for the people who were coming from multiple generations of heritage Buddhism, just so powerful. And because you were talking to so many young or younger or youngish people, that's a very, it was indeed a wide demographic, you probably had immediate access to some of the beautiful qualities that they display. And that's a question that I've previously tried asking you at the Zen 2.0 conference, then we didn't get there because we were not quite following with the timeline, and that kind of got skipped. But it's just a question of what inspiring qualities did you see in these young Asian American Buddhists? What inspired you in how they see the world, how they hold themselves, what they do in this world?
That's a beautiful question. It's such a diverse sample that I'd like caution from generalizing, but at least what I experienced from the people I talked to was, I think, just the ways that they were critically and culturally engaged. I would say that they were interested in really respecting the heritage, the lineages that they'd inherited, and also in adapting them to modern times. And so being creative, sometimes challenging received tradition or knowledge, but always doing this with a sense of humility and respect, and also with a great open-heartedness. No one said Buddhism is only for Asians and should only be. It really came again from this deep place of respect. And I think what inspired me too is just the kind of almost a sense of self that I encountered there. Felt somehow like a sense of self that was in touch, I would say, with Buddhist teachings on impermanence, or even anatta, not self, which is very much related to this notion that there is no perhaps permanent thing that we can point to and say, this is my essence, this is my unchanging self. I think quite organically, a lot of the people I spoke to really understood that. They understood that in this snapshot interview over time, we were going to catch a glimpse of the flow of their life, of their spiritual life. That was going to change. So they understood the people around them, their spiritual lives were going to change. That, one person had actually brought their father more deeply into Buddhism, not the other way around, as we might have expected. There was a kind of, in that, I think, a kind of deep generosity and capaciousness for allowing each of us to actually change, to transform. I think that's actually profoundly hopeful teaching and a profoundly hopeful orientation toward the world. And I think also very importantly in that people really understood, I don't do this alone. I don't walk this path alone. That my family, my ancestors, my heritage, my chosen family, my chosen friends, all of these different people who support me, this is a collective effort. And I think that also deeply touched me. I often say it's very strange to see my name on the cover of this book, because it really was such a collective effort, that we still live in a society that's often very much about valorizing the individual and erasing all the support people behind that individual, right? in their just ways of being selves, of being a self. I think that in and of itself was a Buddhist teaching. And in these kind of hearts of service is something that I learned very deeply from my interviewees as well.
It is very beautiful to see the book as a result or the fruit of collective effort. But I think that's very amazingly also comes through in your second book, because even though it is in a way your story, and this is why I find the interplay of the two books so beautiful. The first book, Be the Refuge, is about how it is important to have our stories told and ideally also heard. And then you actually do that with your own story, but it is actually made up of everyone else's stories. It's multiple strands, it's multiple threads connected together to present a vision, a fleeting and mercurial vision of Chenxing. But at the same time, it's just so many mentors that you talk about with affection and patience and friends. And it's just an interconnection. It's an entire community or a snapshot of a community in the form of a book. And being halfway through it and being absolutely amazed by the gracefulness of your prose, which really is, it's one of the books that I can read both to learn something new and to relax and just to enjoy the beauty of your writing. So I would just like to invite you to tell us a little bit about how that book came to be and whether there were any particular challenges associated with it, whether it was difficult to write a book that is so different in genre from the first one. Just all of that.
Thank you so much, Lobsang. Wow, I'm really moved by your description of the book. I think you understand it completely. If my book met you on the playground, it would already be best friends with you. It would feel so seen and heard. Yes, One Long Listening and Be the Refuge. Each of them took about 9 years from the beginning to publication. So they were long journeys together. I consider the two kind of cousins to each other from common family roots, but maybe you'd have to look a little closely for the family resemblance. One Long Listening really began when I started a year-long chaplaincy residency on an oncology unit here in the Bay Area. I went in not sure if I would become sort of a badge-wearing chaplain, as it were, a full-time employed chaplain with that label in my job title. But I also went in feeling that I'd already done sort of part-time chaplaincy things, and I really needed to devote a year of my life to this education. And as I began, a friend of mine said, I don't really know what chaplains do. I said, I don't either. That's what I'm here to learn, right? And they also just said, maybe you could write about it. And when you're doing a clinical pastoral education residency, a CPE as it's called, and I believe this is, not just in the US, but also more broadly practiced as an educational system, you already do a lot of writing. So I was just taking notes in the back of my mind. And then the autumn after I began this residency, I'd finished it. I was quite burnt out, to be totally honest. It'd been a very difficult year. And I bought a one-way ticket to Taiwan to spend time at a Taiwanese Buddhist monastery. There I was thinking through some questions of especially translation and, again, culture and heritage, this thing we call chaplaincy. I was often speaking with Mandarin speaking patients on the hospital units, and I was often struggling to find the words to explain who I was. And I wanted to see how is spiritual care done in a different cultural context, in what's actually a majority Asian and majority Buddhist context at this monastery. What can I learn there? What are the things that we can translate, and what are the things that are untranslatable? And I think these questions are so relevant for Buddhism, because if we just think about this, 2,600-year history, all of this Buddhism that has been transmitted to us has gone through so many translators, often groups of translators, now anonymous to us. Thanks to their generosity, we can access these precious teachings, right? And so that was another huge impetus for the book. And then the final piece, I would say, the autumn after that, after Taiwan, at that point I was living in Cambodia, a very dear friend of mine passed away from cancer at the age of 29. And a year later, Aaron Lee, the angry Asian Buddhist, would also pass away from cancer at the age of 34. So it was a time of really intense grief for me to lose two very, very dear friends in such close proximity and time. My friend Amy in particular, she was my college roommate. She was a spiritual sister to me. And I just started writing letters to her. And so those letters too are woven into this book. as I write in the bridge of the book, the very beginning, it's a very unconventional book, the way that it's structured. I was in the Guimet in Paris, which has the largest collection of Asian art outside Asia. And I went to the top, to the rotunda, and there was this stunning work of art by the fourth generation bamboo artist, Shoji Kutanabe. That particular sculpture really actually inspired the structure for this book, which is to say his sculptures begin as bamboo in the forest, and he lovingly, patiently, laboriously crafts every single strand. The whole sculpture is held together by, as I say, nothing more than air and weave. There are no nails, there's no glue. And so working these stories, mulling them over, almost like one might take a mala bead, and the ways we have, mala beads, and we might chant, or we might just do our practices again and again. And though it might seem the same each time, something is changing too, something in our understanding and practice. And so writing this book felt like that, of reflecting back on encounters, on stories, on my friend's death, on my grandmother's death, on ancestry, on language, on immigration, on losing a language, on joy, on the surprising, funny moments in the hospital, on all of this, and on how Buddhist teachings for me have permeated it all, but even without being explicit about it. And so, behind me, I have this wood block that one of my favorite teachers in Taiwan, the one who taught spiritual care there, gave me. And the characters read Ichigo Ichie, which is a expression first taught to me by someone in the Buddhist churches of America. And literally, it just means one moment, one encounter. But it really is a reminder that every single moment is precious and fleeting. This particular gathering will never come together like this in the way that it has. It's extraordinary that all of us are gathered here in this very moment. I entered this space one way, and I will leave it changed in a different way. And for that, I'm deeply grateful to each of you for your deep listening and for your deep care. And I hope that one long listening conveys some of that listening and some of that care that I think is so much at the heart of many spiritual traditions, and that it's a touchstone and a reminder that listening and care is there for all of us, even when we're exhausted, even when we're frustrated, even when we're angry, even in those moments, that clarity is always there for us.
That's beautiful. And for those who are here in person by means of Zoom, if you have any questions for Chenxing, please feel free to share them in the chat. We'll try to address them very, very soon. But before that, on the topic of listening also, was my personal experience with the book, and this is for anyone who might want to explore that. It's particularly beautiful when you listen to Chenxing read the audio version of it while you're also following the text. So I would invite all of you to purchase both versions and to experiment with that a little bit, even though, of course, they both work perfectly well on their own. There's just some beauty in hearing the voice of the author. And on this topic of the problem of translating, I think the attempts to describe what is it that a chaplain does are not simply cross-cultural, even though there's a lot of that. I'm constantly struggling with translating the concept of chaplaincy into the Russian language as well, because that's not really a thing at the moment in the Eastern European part of the world. However, you spent a lot of time mulling over that, and trying to come up with some idea. So how would you, in very general terms, describe what is it that a chaplain brings to, for example, people in a hospital, even though chaplaincy is not at all limited to hospitals, of course?
Sure. I ended up often, as I say, not so much just, I ended up just boiling it down to a single word of care. I mean, I think, we can talk about the different forms that care takes, whether that's supporting not just the patients, but also their families and loved ones, and also very crucially, the staff, the people who are there day in and day out. But I think just care, that looks like a lot of different things. I began thinking, oh, it's always going to be prayer, or going to look like a certain way. There's going to be a script. And it's so far from it, right? I think so much of it is trying to listen deeply and understand what is this person's source of spiritual strength? what are the multiple sources of that? And then also, is there spiritual distress happening here, right? Both and. There are different models that we can use, many, many different tools. And I think for people who have been doing chaplaincy for a long time, I'm just so amazed by the kind of almost like nimbleness with which they do the job, the kind of sense of humor they bring to it, because that's also a very, very important tool when the work can get very heavy, it can get very difficult. And I always say chaplains need chaplains too. And so I think part of the very important part of it, we call it self-care, however we want to language that. But when the chaplain does not exclude oneself from the entire system that's working, when they realize that they themselves also need care. That was perhaps the biggest challenge for myself, of losing myself in other people's stories, forgetting to attend to my own, losing myself in other people's spiritual distress, forgetting that in my own life that was present too, and knowing that I too needed spiritual care. So again and again, just care. I really like that, because that also makes room for people who are not religious or multiply religious. It doesn't constrain us in any way. It, I think, is intimate with the truth of how life is always unfolding in unpredictable ways. And as chaplains, I think sometimes the job is just to be in touch with that and make a little bit more space, for possibility.
That is very powerful to me, because even though when you share the stories, not just of the friends you've lost or the relatives, but also so many patients going through the gateways of death, or passing beyond, and then or other members of their families losing a loved one. There's of course a very deeply felt sense of grief and sadness to it, and the sense of profound impermanence and understanding the limitations of these bodies and so forth. And at the same time, in retrospect, at least when you're describing those as past occurrences in a way, your way of narrating the stories is very life affirming, but not to the point of becoming too sugary sweet. It's not that, it doesn't feel like you're making that special attempt, but it's just accepting the reality of all those things and yet touching them all with a little bit of grace. So I'm wondering what, apart from self-care, sustained you in those moments and then helped you see those stories in this very life-affirming way in retrospect as well. Were there things that helped you basically survive this entire period of chaplaincy training, of working with patients and so forth? Because I think for anyone who's joining us who might be interested in one day doing chaplaincy, learning about some of the things that might help and be of help and be of value in terms of sustainability, that might be a good direction to point them towards.
Sure. I mean, certainly the basics like sleep and food and nature, so important, just to spend time with fresh air, outdoors. And then I was very fortunate to have really extraordinary supervisors and a very supportive peer group. So the times when things were just, frankly, very, very tough and really awful, times when I wanted to quit the program, I had people who would sit with me in that, and, who didn't even rush to fix things, who just sat with me in the awfulness of it all, which is what I asked for, and just gave me room to discern what was next, gave me permission to quit if I needed to, said, of course, they would miss me too. And I think being held by this bigger container, so if one is lucky enough, that happens in the place of work, though of course being a Buddhist chaplain in particular can sometimes be a lonely thing. And so there it's finding one's, own container of support, whether that looks like a Buddhist teacher, your practices, who's the Sangha that holds you. And maybe that Sangha is, as one of my friends likes to say, an impossible Sangha or an unexpected Sangha. What does it look like also to cultivate the Sanghas that we need if the Sanghas we dream of are not yet manifest? That can be part of the work as well. And so, yes, my mother's cooking, my friends' cards to me, a little care package, sometimes the simplest things, an ice cream cone, my supervisor saying, "You are so tired, go home. If someone else is on the care team to cover this shift, you need to rest, go take a nap," right? Those little things.
Well, that so powerfully connects to the question of what brings you joy. Because if you ask a chaplain, what brings them joy, or a therapist, or a nurse, or the doctor, they would mention the things that also help them survive, because joy is crucial for surviving all of this. And it seems like part of your own process of surviving and flourishing in a way was travel. You already talked about your time in Taiwan and in Bangkok, in Cambodia as well. So I would just like to ask what it felt like immersing yourself in those communities. It didn't feel, or it doesn't read, at least from my perspective in the book, that you were on a big spiritual journey, capital S, capital J, to explore the Buddhist traditions of those countries. But yet at the same time, there's inevitably a process of immersion and picking something up and then turning it into the tea that you've described. So what were the highlights of your travels across these 3 countries, potentially more? What did you learn that was of benefit? What felt right and felt that like it was bringing you joy in those moments?
Yeah, I think it was just such an honor to be in such Buddhist spaces, and certainly for myself as, someone who actually in Thailand, people often mistake me as Thai, but there was something that was very interesting to be in a country where most people look like me, which is, not the case for the country that I currently live in. And so that was just a learning. That was just something to notice. How did my body feel different? How did my heart and spirit feel different in these spaces? In all of these spaces, I was a bit of an outsider, right? I'm not fluent in any of these languages. Like my Mandarin could always be better. My Thai, sadly, is not very good. My Khmer is sadly quite atrocious. But I think also the humility of realizing that there's still so many ways to connect, even when we don't understand the semantic meaning of language. And then on top of that, something I really love when spending time in Asia is that it's a very multilingual space. I suppose it kind of reminds me of home, where my parents are speaking Mandarin and Shanghainese and English, and it's all mixed. And that's not always the cases for both the Buddhist or just, secular spaces that we travel to in the US. Sometimes it can feel quite aggressively monolingual here, but sometimes just hearing the music of a lot of different kinds of languages and seeing the ways Buddhism is expressed, on the full and half moon days when people are holding lotus buds by the Donlai Sap River in Cambodia, and there's grandmothers and grandchildren, and it's just so lively. There's so much life there. To see the ways Buddhism is interwoven into more majority Buddhist countries or places, I felt absolutely that I learned so much from there, and that it was truly, just such a privilege to be able to learn from others, and in this way that was quite gentle in pace. It's like you said, I wasn't really trying to extract something or rush through the learning, or, I think this kind of learning maybe takes lifetimes, but to just be able to immerse and observe and listen, and then also to be a part of it as well.
Well, and to go back to the topic of communities, and this would be directly or immediately related to this process of travel. Some of the travels were undertaken together with your partner, who is, of course, a very successful Buddhist scholar in his own right, and we do hope to also have him as part of the series as well. But in this way, he will always be forever now known to our listeners as the husband of Chenxing Han, because you came first, and that's quite refreshing on the gender equality note. But what is your perception, or what are the big learnings for you as a person who's been able to observe his work with Southeast Asian communities, with Cambodians in particular? How is it looking at that world through his eyes, or observing him at work? What are the big or inspiring moments in that regard?
Well, I'm so fortunate that Trent is well versed in many Southeast Asian languages, so that also affords us a kind of access and connection that wouldn't otherwise be possible. And a lot of Trent's work is also around Buddhist chant. And so I think some of the most powerful learnings I have is just listening to the power of chant and chanting. And I'm sure many people here themselves can connect with that as well, but especially hearing chanting in a group, hearing chanting, at all times of day for various rituals. I think that's been something that we really enjoy. Each year now, we've been teaching something called Story and Song, which is a retreat focused around the Cambodian Buddhist chanting tradition. And it's open to people of all backgrounds. This last year, we had, I think, our youngest member was 1 year old, and our oldest person was in their 70s. And so these kind of intergenerational spaces, I think that's been part of the joy of traveling with Trent through these spaces, and just getting to talk to people and also listen. And I've gotten, very used to certain conversation threads like, oh, your Khmer is so good. How do you know Khmer? There's certain things I do know in Khmer. So we just have a lot of fun also visiting Buddhist temples as well. It is nice to have a kind of spiritual friend on the path with which to share this.
Yeah, well, and that's one more way of exploring our connection to the heritage traditions or the ancestral traditions through which all this knowledge and all this beauty came to us. Because, of course, one way is to listen to the backyard Buddhists, and another way is to go and travel to those countries when that's available, and we have that privilege. So it's a beautiful, beautiful way to access those communities as well. And as we're slowly approaching the conclusion, I'm going to ask a very practical question, because you've worked not just as a chaplain, but with future chaplains as well. And for those who might potentially want to explore that route, most likely in the United States, but potentially also outside. And I'm saying in the United States because the United States has a greater number of chaplaincy programs than anywhere else in the world, at least in the form that we are familiar with at the moment. So what would be just a tiny bit of advice from you to future chaplains, apart from joining an accredited program, in terms of what other skills to pick up along the way, what things to consider, where to start, how to feel, you have the vocation, like in the religious or religious orders, like how to know that might be right for you to explore, even if you don't stay with it for the rest of your life.
Absolutely. My mentor, Beth Goldring, often quotes her mentor, Gil Fronsdal, saying, and I should add, Beth founded a Buddhist chaplaincy organization in Cambodia. That was really my introduction to Buddhist chaplaincy, Beth being a white American Zen nun, Zen priest, and working with Cambodians who were really, for me, bodhisattvas, people doing this profound work at learning just by their example. So they were my introduction to Buddhist chaplaincy. And I think this chaplaincy, spiritual care, Buddhist chaplaincy is a really interconnected international world. So I think, one piece of advice is certainly just to reach out to other people who you admire, who are doing work in the fields that you're doing. But to go back to Beth, quoting Gil, saying, if the work is not life-giving to you, it won't be life-giving for others. And so much, I think it's just discerning, what is it that feels life-giving? Is it hospice or palliative care? Is it actually working with children in a pediatric setting? Is it something much more creative or unexpected, working, say, in a workplace setting or with the unhoused population or prison populations, or, don't know. And I think sometimes, especially if people are in a period of discernment, just being really open to talking to different people and trying out different settings and immersing oneself, learning, finding mentors and teachers and friends along the way. I think that's been a kind of thread throughout this entire conversation, but always returning to, yes, is it life-giving? Is it joyful? Is it touching something of curiosity? Maybe too, is it challenging? I think often I try to lean into what is challenging, what scares me, is it fearful? And remembering too that I think it's not just about helping others, right? As if there's a self and an other, but so much of the work is this kind of getting to know oneself more intimately. And I think that's part of the deep, it's deeply, wow, right? It's just marvelous, the kind of deepening that can happen, I think, with one's Buddhist teachings and practice when one embarks on this work. And just to know that spiritual care takes so many forms. I think there's the accredited professional paths, but there's a way in which, I hope everyone can get a taste of that training, because the world could use more people who are versed in spiritual care, who are trained in it, who know how to care deeply for ourselves, and then by extension for our loved ones, for our communities.
It is such a beautiful idea of offering spiritual care trainings to all who might want to listen. And we have some colleagues present with us here who I know are good on picking those ideas up and running with them. So before you know, you might have something of that nature running in the UK and across the globe. So if that's what's inspiring to you as listeners, please absolutely try to organize that. And you would definitely find a lot of inspiration in Chenxing's books, both of them, because once again, it's also about representation, seeing other chaplains, being inspired by their work, and therefore wanting to emulate that as well. I know that's been a large part of my own Buddhist journey, seeing people who look at least a little bit like me or have similar life stories or share some aspects of my identity, and then being inspired by that to try and forge a thing of my own. And then perhaps on a very related note, and that would be my final question for today, just a little bit about your own journey as a reader, because of course you cannot be a writer, or well, maybe you can, but most people don't become writers until they've read a lot, like, and they've read something, until they've been inspired by the written word. And in other interviews, you very frequently, when asked this question, you try to elevate other Asian American Buddhist writers. And so any pointers regarding that would be very welcome, but also just a general question about your relationship with the written word, with books, with what sustains you as a reader right now, what you find inspiring, anything on that nature, just to inspire us all to read a little bit more.
What a beautiful question. Your question inspires me to read more. As we're getting ready to move, I'm watching all these books go into boxes and there's so little time to read, and I'm always wanting more time to read. I am reading Scott's book, The Making of American Buddhism, right now. So that's been very inspiring if you're talking about specific books. I've also been reading Shui Meiho and Bennett Bronson's work on 19th century and early 20th century Chinese temples that mix together Taoism and Buddhism and folk traditions. And it's really extraordinary just to learn more about that early history. But to the broader point of reading, I'm so indebted to the public libraries that were available in my youth. That was kind of my after school care and my playground after school. There's just the kind librarians, and I've always read, I think, quite eclectically. I didn't always know what was high literature or low literature, and maybe in retrospect, that's a good thing, that I remember being very influenced by reading books on Hindu mythology as a little kid, just starting to learn English. And even now, I think I love to read broadly, whether fiction, nonfiction, always wishing I had more time to read more Buddhist texts and stories and parables. Yeah, this is, we could probably spend a whole session talking about just this question. Something I would add that I also really love to do is I love to read books that have been recommended by either teachers or friends. Just sometimes it's a glimpse. Yeah, it feels like not only do I get to learn something from the book and that author, but I also get to deepen a kind of affinity with this friend and to learn with them and then to talk about it with a group. So I think reading groups can be such a delight as well. And for myself, writers of color in particular, and women writers of color have been particularly inspiring. But I also love to read translations or read in other languages when it's possible, just to remember to have a kind of diverse reading diet, just like I like to have a diverse diet of different types of foods. So too with the kinds of books and authors whom I'm accessing. We're so lucky to have so much available in this day and age.
That sounds like a perfect segue for all of us to transition into a moment of private reading. And it does feel like we've been visited by a brilliant author in our imaginary library. And I know that I'm living this session a much transformed person. It's really been delightful. And there are so many wonderful points about joy and ancestry and identity, and just so many more points to explore. And for those who are just now coming to Chenxing's work, please absolutely check out the two books. They're beautifully written and beautifully narrated in the audio version if you prefer to listen rather than to read. But I think there's so much to think about and potentially room for future meetings. So I would just like to bow in gratitude to Chenxing and to all of you for joining us today. Once again, express the aspiration for more of our shared friends to come and join us in this space, including Trent, Chenxing's husband, and our shared friend, Elaine Lai, who's a brilliant researcher of Dzogchen at Stanford, but also a playwright and a powerful community organizer. So we will just keep running these sessions together with all of you. Once again, our deepest gratitude to all of you for support. And once this meeting goes online on YouTube, on SoundCloud, and on other platforms, feel free to share with as many people as you'd like so that more people can learn about these two beautiful books and Chenxing's ongoing work. Once again, deep bows of gratitude to everyone, especially Chenxing, and hoping to see all of you very soon. Bye-bye.